Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Fee hikes, residency requirements, charter schools, and much more tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes with the Daily Memphian. Thanks for joining us. I am joined this week by a roundtable of journalists talking about some of the biggest stories of the week, starting with Laura Faith Cabetta from Chalkbeat. Thanks for being here again. Toby Sells from the Memphis Flyer. Thank you for being here again.
Thank you, sir.
And Karanja Janaku from the New Tri-State Defender. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
So I want to start with Laura, because you did, I was joking with you before the story, you've done a number of stories on education, that's your beat, but on Shelby County schools and things going on there that kind of blew my mind. Like each one, and I'm not saying they were bad or good, it was just, there's just a lot going on at Shelby County schools right now. And let's start with charter schools and some of the story you did about charter schools being reined in, expanded, there are 57 charter schools. It just seemed kind of muddy what's happening with the charter schools in Shelby County.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, charter schools have been in Memphis for going on 16, 17 years now. And for the most part of that history, there's been a very scaled down policy on how to really handle all the issues that come up with charter schools. And this summer, the school board passed a policy that was pretty thick and went into a lot of details, and we're starting to see the implications of that new policy and how it's playing out. And the most recent one was about enrollment. Charter schools that have been growing more than what they predicted in their initial applications, the district basically said, okay, now we're going to ask that you submit a petition to be able to accept more students, and we're going to see whether your performance over these however many years stack up so that you can take more students. And considering the fact that over this past decade there hasn't been a lot of attention to that or rules about that, charter school leaders were very caught off guard, and so in the end the school board ended up just scaling only some of them back, but that means that some will have to either disenroll students or take in fewer students next year.
And part of what sort of blows my mind when I read that is, there are 3 schools here that I pulled from your story that's on our side. I think it might be on the Tri-State side and on the Chalkbeat side. Is Memphis Business Academy remove current 2nd through 4th grade about 60 students, 63 students from STEM Academy. Power Center needs to reduce by 135 students. And it's striking, and I'm looking at you, I will look at you, Karanja, just for feedback, like those are real people. Those are students and families and who maybe are having great experiences, maybe, I don't know, but they're just gonna have to leave. It's so strange.
Well, you hit right on it. That's what jumped out at me is families, okay? And the effect that it's gonna have when you just step back overall and the whole just sort of conundrum the parents are in, trying to figure out where's the best place to put your school, how do you afford it, and then what's too many charter schools and areas, and how you're going to judge all of that. So I'm glad that we have Laura to help us keep it.
Well, yeah, I mean, because we've had so many people and talking about education over the years, and school board members, and Dorsey Hobson, the former superintendent, and Joris Ray, the new superintendent, that talking about one of the things that's most difficult is you've got families moving constantly. The kids get in a rhythm and then they move mid-year and they're going from school to school. And that's one of those things they fight. And those are maybe because somebody moves or they get a different job. There are all kinds of reasons. But here's the school saying these, and we just named 250 students. Nah, you're going to have to move on. Mm-hmm. And did they pick these schools because these were low performing schools?
No, it's because they had more enrollment than they had planned on. So, and then from there, the school board said, okay, based on your test scores, who are we going to allow to actually keep those students that they've already enrolled, or will you have to shrink your enrollment?
You may not know this, but if they're going to have 60 kids leave Memphis Business Academy, Hickory Hill Elementary, how are they going to pick? Who picks those 60 students? Mm.
Right, yeah, so it could be that they next year bring in a lower incoming class, so like if it's an elementary school, like take in a smaller kindergarten class, or if they aren't able to do that, then it will be that they'll have to disenroll, but they haven't figured out a plan on how that's going to look specifically, but that's something I'm definitely going to be following on, because that's just, it's really bizarre.
I love that you're as close to this as anyone, and you're kind of as confused about it as anyone and unclear on it. It's really just true. Toby, I don't know that you were covering this. You're a parent. I mean, it's fast. I mean, it's the biggest expense for Shelby County. I mean, it's a huge expense. We'll talk about some other issues on that.
I can only speak as a parent, knowing how difficult it is to figure out where your kid is going to go, and then if you get mid-year, into the year, and somebody says, nope, all this work that you've done, you've got to go back to the drawing board. Totally frustrating.
Yeah, and most of these charter schools, correct me if I'm wrong, they're to some degree application-based, right? I mean, I don't know if they're all comers, but. It's not just a neighborhood school.
Right.
Charter schools are not just first come first serve, or they are first come first serve.
They are, and if there is more applications than there are seats, then they'll have a lottery. But it's not for, you have to have a certain academic threshold or anything like that.
Let's stay with education. Another story you did, which is the unions or associations or whatever they're called, but I will shorthand them as unions. The two different teachers unions are in negotiation with Shelby County Schools about a new contract and some, in some cases, pretty significant raises. Is that correct?
Yeah, so they have been meeting with the district ever since February, off and on. It's been a pretty slow-moving process, and ultimately, I don't think we're going to see what we see in other states where teachers have gone on strike for higher pay or things like that, because as you mentioned, you really can't really call them unions because the state legislature took away most of their bargaining power in 2011. But still, those negotiations matter because it represents, maybe 6,000, over 7,000 employees that would be under that contract. But yeah, so they're going between different proposals on how to raise the base pay of new teachers coming in, keeping veteran teachers, compensating them for their advanced degrees, which hasn't really been a thing in the past few years. And so that's kind of where we're at, is both proposals have been put on the table, and now we're just kind of
and that's expected to be, if it's ratified, whenever they settle, they're expected to settle for the next school year?
That's the hope. Early on, the district said that they wanted to have this done by the time that their budget goes to the county commission in the spring. And we'll see if that happens.
So, and I'll go through a couple numbers here. The proposal would add $2,000 to the compensation of new district teachers, raising the starting salary to $45,000. Teachers with a master's degree can make a salary as high as $74,000. Teachers with a doctorate can make almost $84,000. They're talking about 7 years. It kind of steps up over time, and basically with seniority, the proposed salary structure would cost the district $15 million more in the first year. By the 2023-24 school year, the plan would cost the district about $10 million more annually than they pay now. Mm-hmm. We'll move on to, as we kind of move around here, another thing that everything's going to blow my mind today, Toby. So this is going to be the introduction I do on everything because it's the holiday season. The Greensward parking controversy, shall we call it, there was kind of thrown for a loop this past week. And again, as always, full disclosure, I'm on the board of the Overland Park Conservancy. I was board chair and board vice president during much of the heat of that fight. But your reaction, and you've covered this a lot, when the city came out and said, and all the parties, the zoo, the city, and OPC came out and said, hey, we're going to pause any more construction. The plan was to reconfigure the main lot, encroach on 2.5 acres of green space, Greensward. Instead, we're going to look at a parking deck over at Prentice Place. Mm-hmm. But in the meantime, we're going to stop everything while we kind of study that and try to figure out the costs.
Just having covered this for so long, you think that the end is in sight. I wrote a headline that said Greensward parking to end in 2020, and that's next year. And back when I wrote it, it seemed like a long time. It wasn't going to be here for a long time. And then another pause comes up, and this thing just keeps having legs and legs. But what they said was they've got 90% of Prentice Place done. They're going to pause and look at this modular parking deck, and I had to look at some of those. It's not the big structure that people had a problem with back in 2016 when the mayor first put his proposal together. It looks a little bit different, a little more minimal. I don't know if the neighbors there would have a problem with a similar parking deck, but this comes into play in the timeline because you can only take out trees in the wintertime, is what all the parties said yesterday. And that plays in the timeline because if we were going to get this done now and reconfigure the parking lot, we've only got one winter. If we take this winter to reconsider how we're going to do this, that puts it back to next winter. So that puts Greensward parking maybe into 2021, 22 even. That's not right, 21. It's just this thing just keeps going on and on and on. I just saw Kemp Conrad, and he said, yeah, these things it just keeps going. These similar issues. So we'll see how that goes out.
I have all kinds of comments.
I was going to say, right?
Then I
should ask you.
Yeah, no, and I shouldn't do that. But it was absolutely the position of OPC and the zoo in the city that this was a good thing, and even though it would delay getting parking off the Greensboro eventually, that this was absolutely worth exploring. The price tag would stay the same as reconfiguring the lot, which is kind of remarkable.
Right. And the upside, of course, would be that they would save, what is it, like 2 acres of greensboard or something like that. So, so I can only imagine that, for park advocates, that saving that space is worth the extra time.
Yeah. A thing today that was kind of a weird breaking news kind of alert, I think it was from, I can't remember who it was from, Crunch, and I'm sure you got it as well, was that the Confederate statues had been removed from Shelby County, and were you following this? And it was a strange kind of thing where they were kind of secret. No one knew where those statues had been placed, and we laughed, but also there was a lot of danger around that, right? I mean, it was a very serious issue, and there are a lot of weird people in the world who were very angry about statues coming down around the country. Obviously, in Virginia, most notably. But the two statues were returned to the sons of Confederate veterans and the descendants, I believe. Mm-hmm. Your thoughts when that happened?
Well, I'm sort of glad that it's over. That's the main thing there. That whole issue has been just emotional for a lot of people. Somebody knew where these parks were, and they had to, to get that taken care of. And so, but the thing that I'm looking forward now is where do we go from here relative to the use of the parks and things like that. I know they've got a big event that's happening on Friday down there at Memphis Park. Bill did a good job of that. I went down there the other day, and it's a complete transformation. It's a much more inviting place than it was before.
It was an interesting story that Bill did that was about the parks being reconfigured, and some of the people who had, the Memphis River Parks had taken over the park where the statue was still there, and they were trying to activate the space, and they were doing yoga, and they had a reaction that bluntly, described some of the people involved with that they didn't realize what those statues were. That it was sort of like set your water bottle down on the statue. They didn't understand the symbolism. I didn't. I walked by that statue on a near daily basis for many, many years, and it wasn't until a couple years ago that it became clear to me not just what it was, but what it represented. So
well, I know I was familiar with them. My kids are 28 now, but I remember the Health Sciences Park, which used to be Health Sciences Park, and we would play there. But I was very much familiar with the statue and what it was, and for me, I just use it as an educational thing, and I would talk to my kids about it and things of that sort.
We'll stick with you. You had thoughts. We're not. I don't think we're going to talk about impeachment today because we generally stay pretty focused locally. But the presidential election did come to town. Bernie Sanders has a bunch of stuff going on here. His organizing group, Mike Bloomberg, the Democratic candidate, was in town this past Thursday. Tennessee is, presumed to go for President Trump. It's a very red state. Memphis and the city's not so much. But your thoughts on how is this going to be relevant other than as bystanders over the next year?
Is Tennessee going to be relevant?
Yeah. And in Memphis, how does that play out?
Yeah, well, I think that when I think about it, my first thought is that you are right. It's pretty much a foregone conclusion as far as the Republican side. On the Democrat side, it's the Democratic nomination. It's a battle for the urban areas and the campus communities, right? And so Nashville, Memphis, Knoxville, and that type of thing. And so then the other thing is, Memphis, Tennessee is somewhat like South Carolina in terms of there's been a lot of polling there, and Biden's way ahead, and unless something really gigantic happens, I think that's going to stay the case. Biden tends to be ahead certainly in the African American communities and in the 40-plus communities, and unless he just really messes up, I think he'll be okay here. But the question in part is what's going to happen to the people who are behind, like Warren and Biden, not Biden, but Buttigieg and those type of candidates. Are they going to coalesce behind somebody? They've been sort of all over the place.
Yeah. Let's go back to education, Laura, because again, all the stories you've done recently have been there's just so much going on. And you want to talk about the Peace Force? Do we want to talk about that?
Sure, we could talk about it. So,
and it's a serious issue. It's just awkward name.
Yes, and so how this came up was during the school board was putting together its legislative agenda, its wish list of state lawmakers, and originally there was a thought that this request to create the district's own police force might go on there because it came from the superintendent, but school board members basically didn't have enough information to be able to say, yes, we want to go ahead and ask the state about this, because it is such a charged issue to be able to say when we're talking about bringing police into schools. Police are already in schools, but talking about who reports to who and who gets to create the policies around that has been really interesting. There's only about 30 or 40 sheriff deputies in schools. The rest are already security that are employed by SCS. But when it comes to sheriff deputies, they don't report to the district. They report obviously to the sheriff. And one interesting caveat that I think about that is when we're talking about undocumented immigrants who are here, parents that are going in and out of schools. In school, for school staff, they are not allowed to talk about, a student or a parent's status, immigration status, but that's not the same case for a sheriff deputy. They don't report to the schools. And so that's been a really interesting issue to be able to go through.
Is it ultimately that the school this came from Joris Ray,
Yes.
the relatively new, maybe 1 year in superintendent, to replace those deputies with
Yes.
staffers? That's the goal.
It didn't start with him though, right? Didn't they discuss this issue?
Yeah, 10 years ago under Kreiner Cash, when he came from Miami, he also brought Gerald Darling, who is who's over security for SCS now, and he had the same position in Miami where he was the police chief over a district-controlled police force, which in this case they're calling a peace force.
The bottom line is the concern about discipline, right? I mean, the fact that we got to have a conversation about whether we're going to have police deputies or more the other, there's a discipline problem, right? And then there's also a problem about how the people who are in charge of enforcement, how they see and view the kids and how they go about the business of the enforcement, and there seems to be concern about that.
Yeah, and so the two sides are, if it's under district, then the district will have more say on how they interact with students, but as some board members said during that meeting, the problem is there whether they're under district or not, so we need to address that before we talk about who is part of this police force.
Well, and I can remember, over the years of covering police in schools back to when I was a reporter at a little community paper, it was initially all about, wait, are you heightening the advocates for police or security, armed security in schools? It was all about, there might be dangerous kids who come in, there might be fights that happen, and then is that security or police person heightening the tension or lowering the tension? And that was the debate for a long, long time. Well, now in the era of school shootings and far too frequent school shootings, that's a whole other issue in this, because you've suddenly got school shootings happening so much that schools are having to put in security systems, put in all kinds of things to deal with that. And it's sort of changed the debate over the time I've been covering this police and schools issue.
Yeah, I see where you're going there, and obviously the mass police shootings is a big deal, but
the mass shootings in schools.
Yeah. But the bigger issue, not a bigger issue, but I mean, that's really not what they're dealing with so much on here. Is that they just have a basic problem of discipline in schools here. I mean, across the board. And how are you going to get the environment in check so that kids can learn and teachers can do that? It is a serious problem.
We'll switch back to you, Toby, on a story you did on housing recently and Wall Street firms and rentals, and talk about what you wrote about for the Flyer.
Yeah, that's right. And the issue, I came on the issue. I attended Mayor Strickland's Housing Summit a couple of months ago and happened to sit on a panel where they were talking about this stuff, and it blew my mind. I did not know half of what they were talking about. And so if you go back to the recession, foreclosure crisis, and it left a lot of vacant homes in low-income neighborhoods. You think about Fraser. Fraser was kind of the neighborhood that I focused on in my story. A lot of those homes sat vacant, and for some reason, a lot of Wall Street firms, equity-backed firms, have come into Memphis and other cities and they go in these low-income neighborhoods and they'll scoop up these houses, sometimes by the hundreds. And they'll use them. They'll put a coat of paint on there, not do a whole lot of maintenance, and put renters in there. And
it's an interesting, dynamic. We did a show recently with Steve Lockwood from the Fraser Community Development Corporation, Rashawn Austin from who's the CDC and ACDC in South Memphis, and Noah Gray, the CDC in Binghamton. And this dynamic, it's something like 25% of the houses, the single-family homes in Memphis, are owned by are rentals, and a huge percentage are owned by out-of-town firms. And as Steve Lockwood would say, they're not all the same, right? There are some that are good, and there are some that are not.
Right.
And it isn't a one-size-fits-all. He is a big advocate for, he and others are big advocates for, look, for what you're paying in rent, you could be buying a home. And Fraser has some very not aggressive, but kind of creative programs of trying to say to people, hey, we'll help you with down payment assistance and get you in a home that you own, so you're building equity versus rental. But it's interesting what happens in the next recession. There was also a story that came out this last week on housing that Memphis is a top 10 housing market in terms of pricing, which seemed impossible years ago. How does that impact people in rentals and these out-of-town people and so on?
Yeah, and some of the facts that I pointed to in my story, Zillow, the real estate website, they said that last year 65% of single-family homes here were rented homes. And said that Memphis was the fastest growing rental market.
That traded hands, 65% of that.
That's exactly right. Yeah. But it made it Memphis the fastest growing rental market in the country, and that's huge because 3/4 of all Memphis housing stock are single family homes.
Yeah.
But these experts that we're talking about, these Wall Street firms coming in, they did not have very nice things to say about these firms or their practices, and they said that they'll get people in there, and one of the strategies that they use to kind of pump up their profits is they'll either evict people or they'll threaten eviction. And so as soon as you threaten eviction, then you've got all these fines and fees that you can collect, back rent, and then if you don't go through with it, then you've got this extra money. And kind of the headline thing that this does is what a lot of the experts I talked to, they said it sucks a lot of wealth out of especially African American neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Well, especially if you have all these, if those are the major players changing hands in real estate, then it's harder for people to cross over from being renters to home buyers.
That's exactly right.
And build wealth.
Yeah, because these Wall Street firms come in and pay cash. They pay good money. They're upping the rates on the houses to some extent. And it's when you at its worst, it reminds me of subprime, right? And the abuse that subprime lending did to African American communities, where targeted or not, or whatever. I think the data is out there that subprime has been limited, but now it's almost been replaced. Go ahead.
Well, I think that you made a good point, and that is when you mentioned Steve Lockwood, okay, because I did see that show. That was a good show too. But he said that it's not everybody, and I think that's important. We don't want to just throw everything out. There are some of these developers, these out-of-town owners. They've worked out a process that it does work well. I happen to be in one, frankly, so full disclosure on that, right?
Yeah. So, and it plays out. Renting is so interesting because it plays out in multifamily in, say, Germantown, where Germantown put a moratorium on multifamily because it is kind of talked about sideways, but they don't want renters. Not everyone in Germantown, but there are people in Germantown who don't want renters because they view a renter as somehow not invested in the community, not paying taxes, even though they really are paying taxes through their rent. So it's an interesting argument that even with a good landlord, some people are very anti-renting, and it all needs to be people invested in their community through ownership. With a couple of minutes left, I want to come back to one of your other stories, Laura, which is and I want to be careful about this, but it is a little complicated. The coach at Trezevant, who was got in trouble for accused of grade fixing. There were in the end, some 53 students graduated from Trezevant without having gone through the classes, passed the classes they should have. Tell us about that story and where it stands now. This was a couple years ago that this blew up.
This all started 3 years ago when he initially was suspended for exactly that, for changing grades from what the district had found. And later on, when the principal of Trezevant resigned and that had prompted some external investigations from outside law firms to be able to look over this again. After that investigation was when the coach was fired. And so a judge now has said that the district couldn't use the same facts from that previous investigation and the second investigation to say, oh, we're going to suspend you, and the second time around say, oh, actually we're going to fire you. There wasn't anything new that was brought up from what the judge was saying, because even though the district said at the time, oh, we have additional evidence that made it more obvious to what he had done.
Did the system, I mean, you've covered Shelby County School System, did they put in place procedures and more monitoring to prevent that sort of, because it was widespread grade fixing at Trezevant?
Yeah, there's all sorts of processes. They have fewer people who are even authorized to be able to make those kind of changes. Principals are supposed to give monthly reports of any changes to grades, which not all of them are bad. It could just be, there was makeup work done or something like that. But they do have a monthly report of all of them to make sure that that it's all above board. But yeah, this is a pretty shocking reversal of that decision to be able to allow the coach to come back to his job if that's what happens.
With 30 seconds left, Toby, so not only is it possible that we will no longer have to park on the Greensward when we go to the zoo, but we might be able to get a beer.
That's right. Legislation was filed last week. Brian Kelsey, a bill that would allow alcohol sales during regular zoo hours over there. A lot of people had a lot of different thoughts on it. Knoxville, Nashville zoos, they were given permission by the legislature last year. Neither one of them are selling alcohol just yet, trying to get all the licenses and fees, but it's going to be interesting to see how that goes forward.
All right, we will leave it there. Thank you all. Thank you for joining us. Next week we have Kemp Conrad, the outgoing chair of the City Council, and Patrice Robinson, the incoming chair. Please join us for that. Thank you for joining us. Join us again for that show next week.